Long Beach, 1958. The ground at the center of the Wilmington oil field has dropped 29 feet. Not cracked, not shifted, dropped. Almost 3 stories, straight down, across more than 20 square miles of a living city. Pipelines snapped, buildings cracked off their foundations, streets buckled into slow, permanent waves. In the harbor, the U.S. Navy's primary Pacific dry dock was tilting, its gates warping, its instruments drifting, its ability to repair warships quietly failing. Look at aerial photographs from that period, and you see something that should not exist. Neighborhoods ringed by earthen levees. Not because they sit on a coastline, because the land beneath them fell below sea level. This was not an earthquake, not a flood, not geological bad luck. This was deliberate extraction, permitted and profited from for 25 years from directly beneath a populated city. And nobody with the power to stop it ever tried. The Wilmington oil field was discovered in 1932 beneath the working-class district of Wilmington along the southern edge of Los Angeles, close enough to the port of Long Beach that the wells were practically within sight of the harbor cranes. By the time the first derricks went up, the area was already populated. Warehouses, homes, a naval station, a working harbor. None of that stopped anyone. Oil was valuable. The ground beneath Wilmington was saturated with it, and the technology to extract it existed, so they extracted it. By 1940, U.S. Geological Survey benchmarks were already showing measurable ground movement. The surface was dropping, not by catastrophic amounts yet, but dropping, and the measurements were public record for anyone who wanted to read them. By 1951, operators had pulled more than 100 million barrels from the field. The subsidence was no longer a survey anomaly. It was a structural emergency in slow motion. Buildings were tilting. The harbor floor was shifting relative to the sinking land around it. Infrastructure built for one elevation was operating at another. By 1958, the epicenter of the subsidence bowl had dropped 29 feet. That is not gradual settling. That is the physical floor of a city collapse beneath the people who live on it. The total damage would eventually be estimated at over $100 million, and that figure counted only what could be repaired. For context, the Wilmington event became one of the largest episodes of human-caused land collapse ever recorded in any American urban area. Mexico City's subsidence crisis, frequently cited in the same academic literature, unfolded across generations of water table depletion. Long Beach's crisis was built by a specific industry, under active regulatory oversight, for profit, inside a city that already knew it was happening. To understand what happened physically, you need to understand what oil extraction actually does to the ground beneath a city. Underground oil reservoirs are not hollow caves. The oil is suspended inside porous rock formations under enormous pressure that holds the layers of rock and sediment above them slightly apart. When you extract that fluid, you reduce that pressure. The rock above begins to compact. The surface drops, slowly, then faster, then in ways that cannot be undone without active intervention. This mechanism was not a surprise. Geologists understood subsidence from fluid extraction by the early 20th century. The question was never whether it would happen beneath Wilmington. The question was who would be responsible when it did. In the case of Long Beach, the field sat directly beneath some of the most densely developed industrial and residential zones in Southern California, the Wilmington District, Terminal Island, and the Port of Long Beach. When the ground dropped unevenly across that landscape, the consequences were not abstract. Pipelines built on a level grade were now operating on a tilted one. Underground utility corridors designed for a fixed alignment were running through ground that had shifted 3, 10, 15 feet below where it had been. Building foundations set into solid earth were now cantilevered over slowly compacting strata. The response, for years, was not to stop the extraction. It was to engineer around the sinking. Earthen berms and flood levees were constructed along the harbor perimeter and around vulnerable neighborhoods. Not because those areas bordered open water, because the land had fallen below sea level, and without the berms, the ocean would come in. The city built levees to contain the sea from neighborhoods that had never needed them. Not because the water rose, because the ground fell. And the same municipal government that ordered those levees was also collecting royalty payments from the oil field doing the sinking. By the early 1950s, the crisis had a human face, though not the one most people would have expected, and not the one that should have been required to force a response. The Long Beach Naval Station sat at the western edge of the subsidence zone on Terminal Island. It was not a minor or symbolic installation. It was the United States Navy's primary dry dock facility on the Pacific coast, the place where capital ships came for major structural repairs, hull work, and overhaul. And by 1951, Navy engineers had produced something that should have ended the debate immediately. Internal assessments documenting that the dry dock gates were warping beyond operational tolerance. Precision alignment instruments were drifting. The mechanisms that sealed a dry dock chamber and pumped it empty, mechanisms that had to hold to within fractions of an inch, could no longer hold because the ground beneath them was moving. Navy engineers filed formal reports. They notified California state officials. They notified the city of Long Beach directly. The message was not technical or hedged. If subsidence continued at its observed rate, the installation would lose the functional capacity to operate as a dry dock. A major military facility was being destroyed by an oil field operating beneath it. The Navy had no royalty stake in the Wilmington field. It had no Tidelands revenue. It had a dry dock that was no longer level. Meanwhile, in Wilmington itself, residents were experiencing the same collapse without the political weight to make anyone listen. Streets that had drained cleanly now pooled water after any rain. Homes built on solid grade were behind earthen berms now, their underground plumbing steadily cracking, their foundations incrementally shifting. There was no single dramatic event, only the slow accumulation of wrong. A floor that tilted, a basement that flooded, a pipeline that needed emergency repair for the third time in 4 years. These were working-class households in a refinery and port district. They had no engineers filing formal complaints to the governor's office. They had cracked walls, backyard levees, and a city government that was simultaneously cashing royalty checks from the companies whose wells were doing the damage. Here is what makes the Long Beach subsidence not just a catastrophe, but a designed arrangement. The city of Long Beach did not merely permit the extraction, it profited directly from it. Under California's Tidelands oil framework, codified through revenue agreements between the state, the city, and the operators following the California Lands Act of 1938, the city of Long Beach received royalty payments from production on tidelands it had been granted authority to lease. The oil beneath the Wilmington field and the adjacent harbor area was not only privately extracted, it was municipally monetized. The entity with the most direct regulatory leverage over what was happening beneath Long Beach, the city government itself, had a financial incentive not to slow the extraction down. Every barrel pulled from the Wilmington field generated income that flowed into city coffers. That income funded civic projects, public infrastructure, and city operations. Long Beach was not a passive bystander to an industry's behavior. It was a co-beneficiary of the process that was collapsing its own ground. The major operators on the field, Standard Oil of California, Shell Oil Company, and Union Oil Company of California, knew exactly what the technical solution to subsidence was. Water injection, pumping pressurized water back into depleted reservoir zones to restore underground pressure and halt compaction. The technique had been demonstrated successfully at the Goose Creek oil field in Texas as early as the 1920s. It was not experimental or speculative. It worked. Operators knew it worked, and they opposed it anyway. The argument they repeated to the California Division of Oil and Gas throughout the 1940s was that water injection would damage reservoir integrity, reducing effective yield and requiring costly shared infrastructure across competing leases. The California Division of Oil and Gas had statutory authority to mandate remediation practices across the field. It did not use that authority. Through the 1940s and into the early 1950s, the agency deferred to industry objections, issuing no binding order. The structure was precise. The city collected royalties. The operators extracted oil. The ground collapsed. The residents absorbed the physical cost. The regulatory agency responsible for preventing it issued no mandate to stop it. This was not regulatory carelessness. It was regulatory deference, sustained by a financial arrangement that made the most powerful actors in the system more comfortable with inaction than with the costs of a fix. What makes this genuinely difficult to set aside is not that nobody knew. It is that the evidence was documented, formally transmitted, and then deprioritized at every level that had the authority to act on it. The U.S. Geological Survey published subsidence measurements showing ground movement in the Wilmington area as early as 1940. These were not internal industry records or classified reports. They were public benchmark surveys available to state agencies, city engineers, and oil operators simultaneously. In 1945, engineering studies commissioned by the city of Long Beach documented the subsidence explicitly, where the ground was dropping, at what rate, and what the projected trajectory looked like if extraction continued unchanged. Those reports were received, discussed, and filed. Extraction continued unchanged. By 1951, the Navy's formal engineering assessments made the consequences concrete and federal. If a USGS benchmark and a city engineering study had not moved the regulatory needle, a complaint from the United States Navy should have. It did not. California state officials acknowledged the concern. The city of Long Beach acknowledged the concern. Operators were asked, not required, to evaluate solutions. A voluntary limited water injection pilot was launched in 1954, nearly a decade after the city's own engineers had documented the problem in measurable terms. The pilot was too small, too localized, and too dependent on operator cooperation that never fully materialized. Subsidence continued. Two separate attempts to move toward mandatory water injection were blocked before the late 1950s, each time by the same operator objections. Shared infrastructure was too costly. Reservoir yield impacts were too uncertain. Coordination across competing adjacent leases was too complicated. These were genuine engineering challenges. They were also challenges that had been resolved at other fields, under other regulatory frameworks, when the regulatory will existed to require resolution. At Goose Creek in Texas, at fields in Oklahoma and Venezuela, operators had managed water injection programs under regulatory pressure. The technology had not stalled, the mandate had. In Long Beach, the U.S. Geological Survey records documented the dropping ground. The city's own engineers documented the dropping ground. The Navy documented the dropping ground. And for 15 years, the ground kept dropping while the most powerful parties in the arrangement found reasons to wait. What finally broke the paralysis was not a neighborhood flooding, not a pipeline rupture, not even the visible collapse of a residential block. It was the U.S. Navy informing the federal government that one of its most strategically significant Pacific dry dock facilities was on the verge of becoming operationally inoperable, and that it would not accept further delay. In 1958, under direct federal pressure from the U.S. Department of the Navy, California mandated a full-scale water injection program across the Wilmington oil field. Operators were required, for the first time, legally required, to inject pressurized water at depth to restore subsurface pressure and halt compaction. The era of voluntary pilots and deferred action was over. It worked. By 1965, subsidence at the epicenter had halted. Survey benchmarks that had been dropping for 25 years held stable. The field showed a partial rebound, ground rising approximately 1 foot at the center of the bowl as subsurface pressure was gradually restored. The same technology operators had called too costly and too risky for 20 years performed almost exactly as the Goose Creek evidence from 4 decades earlier had suggested it would. What saved Long Beach was not its own government, not its residents, not its regulatory agency. It was the United States Navy, whose dry dock could not be rebuilt on a royalty check. Now here is the second twist. Water injection halted the sinking, but restoring subsurface pressure across a field crossed by active fault structures did not behave in isolation. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, seismologists documented clusters of small induced seismic events in areas adjacent to the Wilmington field, pressure changes interacting with geology in ways the original injection program had not fully modeled. In December 1963, the Baldwin Hills Dam, a reservoir facility in the hills above Los Angeles and connected to a separate but related set of subsurface pressure operations, failed. The collapse sent 77 million gallons of water into the neighborhoods below. 5 people died. Hundreds of homes were destroyed. Subsequent investigations identified fault reactivation and subsurface fluid pressure changes as contributing factors, the consequences of manipulating underground geology without fully modeling what came next. The fix that stopped the sinking had introduced a pressure that no one had accounted for. Go back to that aerial photograph, Long Beach Harbor, 2958. The subsidence bowl at its deepest, neighborhoods behind their levees, the tilted dry dock, 29 feet of missing ground spread across 20 square miles of a city that stayed where it was while the earth beneath it went somewhere else. That bowl was not geological fate. It was the physical shape of a financial decision. A city that leased its tidelands to oil operators, collected royalties on the extraction, received its own engineers' documentation of the damage, watched the Navy file formal warnings, and did not act until a federal installation made inaction politically impossible. The residents of Wilmington did not have a dry dock. They had cracked foundations and flooded basements and earthen berms outside their windows. They absorbed the physical cost of an arrangement that generated income for the city that was nominally responsible for their protection. Their damage was real, documented, and insufficient to move anyone with the authority to stop it. The ground at the epicenter has partially rebounded. The levees are still there. The pipelines have been replaced. The streets releveled. The bulkheads rebuilt. Wilmington remains one of the most economically disadvantaged communities in Los Angeles County, a port district, a refinery corridor, a place where the land was always valued less than what sat beneath it. Los Angeles did not sink Long Beach by accident. It built a revenue stream that made sinking profitable, a regulatory framework that made inaction defensible, and a political structure that made residents' suffering insufficient grounds for interruption. It stopped only when the military could no longer park a ship. The 29 feet is still there, in the benchmark records, in the USGS surveys, in the shape of the streets that had to be regraded, in the levee walls that should not exist. You can measure the exact depth of the decision that made it happen. It is all in the public record. It always was.